Hello, I'm John Maynard, Senior Director of Programs at the Freedom Forum, and welcome to First Five Live. For 30 years, the Freedom Forum has told powerful stories of the First Amendment's 5 freedoms in exhibits and programs all over the world, and has educated millions on the power of the First Amendment. One of the ways we have conveyed this message is through the power of photojournalism. As director Nora Ephron once said, that photographs disturb readers is exactly as it should be. That's why photojournalism is often more powerful than written journalism. Today, we discuss the work of one of the more acclaimed photojournalists of our time, Ted Polumbaum, and we explore his life with someone who knew him best, his daughter, Judy. Judy is a University of Iowa professor emerita of journalism and mass communications, and is a journalist, scholar, and educator. She is the author of the new book, All Available Light, The Life and Legacy of Photographer Ted Polumbaum, which provides an intimate portrait of Ted and chronicles his coverage of some of the most critical struggles of the latter half of the 20th century. The Freedom Forum shares a special connection with the Polumbaum family. After Ted's death in 2001, his widow, Nina, donated his archives to the museum, and his collection endures through online programming, traveling exhibits, and other outlets. His archives remain the single largest holding by an individual photographer in our permanent collection. Judy, welcome to First Five Live.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure.
And to our viewers, we hope you will ask your questions, and you can use that chat button at the bottom of your screen. Judy, first of all, congratulations on the new book. You write that your dad never really planned to make photography his life work. Tell us how he became a photojournalist.
Well, I remember it well since I was in the womb. No, not really. I have reconstructed this story. A federal marshal appeared at my parents' door in the spring of 1953 with a subpoena from the House Committee on Un-American Activities, directing my father to appear in Washington, D.C. to testify on communist subversion in education. The reason was when he returned from World War II to finish college, he'd been in a progressive campus student group that ended up on a subversion list. He defied the committee. He stood on the Fifth Amendment, which by then had been proven in courts to be a better protection than the First, but he referenced the First for sure. And he refused to answer questions about his political views or affiliations. And he charged the congressmen with shredding the Bill of Rights, which they were. And he charged them with putting him on trial by publicity, which they were. And he charged them with trying to wreck his livelihood, which they were. After the hearings, he was summarily fired by United Press in Boston, where he worked as a news writer. And he took up a childhood hobby again, photography. He began assembling a portfolio. He brought it around. He made many trips from Boston to New York to the Time Life building in Rockefeller Center to pester the editors of Life, which was the Holy Grail. And Life finally started assigning him photo assignments. And that was it. The dam broke, the waters parted, the portals opened. He had a new career. He was successful. He was working for the most popular photo magazine of the time and the whole Time Life stable. And he was on his way. He was a very lucky victim of the period we call McCarthyism.
Right, right. And we're going to look at some of those photos in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about his philosophy about photojournalism. What do you think to him made a great picture?
Well, he was especially interested in the lives of ordinary people. although he often had the challenge of photographing celebrities. But to him, firstly, the photograph was never about the photographer. It was about the subject matter. Secondly, he photographed people. In his repertoire, he has lots of great photos of landscapes and still lives, but that wasn't his true interest. A good picture had people engaged in their lives. A picture had depth, a picture had complexity, and a picture showed the world as close as possible as he could make it to what he saw through the lens and what he believed to be truth, although he was very aware of the photograph's power to distort and misrepresent.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about, growing up with your dad. You have a great line in your book saying that you and your siblings were your father's foremost photogenic guinea pigs. And we have a photo, the photo from the book of you and your sister in India in the early 1960s. Tell us about being, in front of his lens so many times, what that was like growing up.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, now imagery is ubiquitous, both still and moving imagery. Photos are at our fingertips. We have our cell phones. I think my dad would have cheered the democratization of photography this way. But when I was growing up, most family portraits were studio portraits or school portraits. But my older sister and I, and later my younger brother, grew up surrounded by these very artistic, beautiful, interesting, lively documents of our lives, of the lives of friends and our friends' children. And it was kind of peculiar. It was different. But it's lovely to have that documentation of the family. And of course, it's lovely that now photography like that is within everyone's reach.
Interesting you said just now that, everyone's got the iPhone and whatnot. You touched on it a bit, but if you could expand a little bit, what would your father think about the state of photography and photojournalism today? Especially with the use of social media to spread images globally in an instant.
Well, first of all, I think my father was not a very good self-promoter. So he probably would be struggling because so much for a freelance photographer now depends on getting your name as well as your work out there. Secondly, I think he would be very happy about the fact that photography is within everyone's reach. I think he might be a little bit sad at how much people take photography for granted. And, so much of the pictures that just people shoot in the ordinary course of things are pretty pedestrian. People don't put a lot of time and thought into what's going to come up in the picture because it's so abundant. I mean, you don't need to ration film. You don't need to print pictures in a wet darkroom. So I think he would be both cheered and have reservations. But of course, he would be thrilled at the terrific work that many young photojournalists are doing now.
Great. I want to, we showed you that picture of you as a young child in India. And you say in the book that it was in India where Ted truly began to realize his craft. And we'll have a few sample shots from India that we'll show you. What do you think it was about India that inspired him? And this was in the early 1960s, I believe.
Right, 1961.
Yep.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that my mother was somewhat of the provocateur in getting us to India. My father inherited some money from his favorite uncle, who was a lifelong bachelor and a globetrotter and a syndicated cartoonist. And rather than doing something responsible for it, at my mother's urging, my parents splurged on round the world plane tickets for them and my sister and me. They pulled my sister and me out of school and took us around the world, and most of that time was spent in India. And my father was interested in exploring a different culture, in exploring traditions of Gandhian nonviolence, in exploring the lives of ordinary laboring people. This is a picture from the Ganges River. And he had a lot of time life assignments when he was in India, but most of his best work was his own work, and most of it has never been published.
Mm.
And he really came into his own as an observer and a student of a very different culture that also had, all sorts of human beings just like us. And he came away with a very interesting philosophy of photographing poverty and distress. He didn't want to make people look miserable. He wanted to find uplifting scenes. He wanted to show how people were resilient in the face of distress. And he found a great deal of that in India. And his pictures, although they are, more than 50 years old now from that period, they really endure. They are absolutely stupendous documents of a society.
Yeah, they really are wonderful shots. As you said, and you just concluded saying he preferred documenting the lives and struggles of ordinary people. But he did have some experience covering celebrities, more well-known people. Let's take a look at just a couple. This is, I want to show a picture that he took of the great Muhammad Ali. This was taken in 1964. And the boxer was recovering from a hernia operation. And as you can see, his mother is gently combing his hair. It's a wonderful shot. I want to ask you a couple questions on this. First of all, do you remember how he got this image? And I think there's a funny story related to that in terms of him leaving the hospital room.
Right. Muhammad Ali was due to fight a rematch with Joe Frazier, and it was interrupted and postponed because of this hernia. And Life sent Dad to the hospital and said, get a picture of, they still called him Cassius Clay in the media, even though he'd changed his name and joined the Nation of Islam. Get a picture. And so Dad went to the hospital. He went in, he found Ali's mother there very solicitously combing his hair. He asked if he could photograph. They were very welcoming and warm and said, of course. Dad took a roll of pictures. As he was leaving, the Fruit of Islam guards who'd been assigned to guard Ali's room by the Nation of Islam stopped him and said, no pictures, give us the film. And of course, these were large, intimidating men. My father gave them a roll of unexposed film and laughed because he had the subject's permission. He laughed and he got the film to life and got the picture.
Very clever. That's a wonderful story. You have a chapter in the book titled Prelude to Camelot, and Ted, your dad, saw a good deal of Jackie and Carolyn Kennedy during JFK's time representing Massachusetts and throughout his run for president. I think we're going to show you a shot of Jackie watching the nomination from her home that she was on the Cape, Hyannisport. But tell us what his overall impressions were of the Kennedys. I know you were just a young child at that point, but did he enjoy spending time with them?
Well, I was a young child who adored Carolyn Kennedy. I thought she was, the perfect little girl. I wanted to be her. Life had incredible access, and that picture of Jackie in a room at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, when Jackie is pregnant with John, and JFK's on the other side of the country in LA accepting the Democratic nomination for president was an exclusive. My father was the only photographer in the room. He liked Jackie a lot. He did a lot with Jackie and Jack when Jack was a senator and around Boston and Massachusetts. He thought Jackie was great fun. He said she smoked and swore like a sailor, but never on camera. But you know, he was more reticent about the Kennedy name generally, and he thought the Kennedys had an oversized royal reputation that they hadn't necessarily earned. When Ted became a senator, essentially inheriting his brother's seat, although he was elected, my father was particularly dubious. But it turned out that Teddy really wanted to learn and hired very, very smart staff members. And so over time, as Ted Kennedy became a distinguished, competent, effective senator, you know, my parents' admiration for him really grew. But they weren't just wowed automatically by the Kennedy name.
Right. Speaking of, and this is a good time to bring up another point in your book, which is that Ted, your father, despised PAC journalism, and I believe those, I'm using your words, despised PAC journalism and paparazzi, and Kennedy's did become the subject of paparazzi, you know, later for future Kennedys. Tell us why. What was, and what do you think he would think today? I mean, you know, and with paparazzi and that. And the ethos that was, certainly in his time, the ethos was starting to develop around celebrities, but now it's a whole different level.
Well, he thought it was cruel. I mean, my father was a very political person with strong political convictions, progressive political convictions, and often had to photograph people who had done things that weren't that great or whose ideas he disagreed with. You know, but he felt it was his job to represent people fairly. And he thought the idea of paparazzi chasing people was just cruel and unnecessary. And also, if other people were doing it, he certainly didn't want to be doing it because there'd be pictures out there. He didn't want to have the same pictures as everyone else. So sometimes because of life, he could have an exclusive. He had exclusive access to people. But other times, he preferred not to try to chase people, particularly if they were in an unhappy situation. When Jackie Kennedy had her third child, who only lived for 2 days, he photographed the hospital from the outside, from a building across the way. He didn't even try to get access to the family. When Teddy Kennedy drove off Chappaquiddick Bridge, he photographed the bridge. You know, there are other ways to get the story besides harassing people. I think he'd just be totally uninterested in the kind of paparazzi chasing of celebrities that goes on today. That was already starting, certainly by the late 60s when People magazine came along. That ushered a lot of that in.
Right. Some of your dad's most memorable photos, came out of Freedom Summer in 1964. Of course, that was a concerted effort by major civil rights organizations to draw media attention to racial discrimination in the South. I want to show you, I think, of kind of a chilling image of Andy Goodman, who is in the black T-shirt. Probably one of the final images of him, as he was one of 3 civil rights workers who was tragically murdered that summer. Tell us a little bit about your dad's approach, you think, in covering this movement. From what I understand, he did not do this for Life, but rather for Time magazine. Do I have that correct?
Right. Life had the civil rights movement very well staffed in the South. So Dad asked Time if he could go down and cover the volunteers. They started out in Oxford, Ohio, on a college campus where they had a week of orientation. And then another group came for another week, but my father was there for the first week. And that was the week Andy Goodman was there and left a couple days early with two other volunteers to go investigate a church bombing in Mississippi. And of course was, never reappeared, was arrested, let go, kidnapped, murdered. 3 bodies found later in an earthen dam 6 weeks later. So that was the atmosphere into which these young volunteers were heading. And my father was very interested in what would motivate young people to do this. I think he wondered if he would have had the gumption to do it if he'd been college age at the time. He went down to Jackson, Mississippi, moved into a motel on the white side of town, found it so scary he moved to the black side of town. And he went around with volunteers, spreading voter registration information, starting freedom schools, teaching kids. This is probably his most reproduced picture of the volunteers getting ready to leave orientation in Oxford, Ohio, and get on buses to head down to the heart of bigotry and segregation in Mississippi. My father said Mississippi in the summer of '64 was the scariest place he'd ever been. And he'd been in World War II under Japanese bombing, although he was, a kid then, a young man. But he found it terrifying. He was in absolute awe of these young people, of the civil rights workers, of the African American families that put them up, of the African Americans who had the gumption to go to the courthouse and try to register. He saw, all sorts of bravery amidst tremendous intimidation. Burly sheriffs with, big hats and billy clubs and guns on their hips, and angry white mobs. So he came back to Boston, I think, sobered and shaken and, more convinced than ever that the civil rights movement was a great movement, and he would do what he could to support it and promote it.
Yeah, and I assume, it's as a photographer, he's there to bear witness, but I assume it was just hard for him not to be involved and to talk to these students and volunteers about what they were going through. I think in the book you write that he took copious notes on Freedom Summer, but nothing about his own doings, which I thought was interesting.
Right. My brother was very little then, and he called my mother from time to time, but I don't think he revealed a lot just because it was so terrifying.
Yeah. And speaking of
but also the Northern press, by definition, was the enemy. Also, he was not welcome down there.
Yeah, I want to just share one more photo because you did mention the gumption and courage, and it's a photo of a young a black woman being dragged by the arm across a brick paving in Greenwood, Mississippi. And I understand that there's also video of this, correct? And your dad got a
right.
This
woman was pregnant at the time,
wow.
There's some television footage that appears in the PBS American Experience program on Freedom Summer that shows this same image from the other side. So there's a glimpse of my father, tall, skinny, with his Leicas around his neck.
Right.
So he left very few traces of himself in Mississippi, but there's one.
Yeah. I want to actually, we do have a first question, and if you could go back in time again to the House Un-American Activities Committee, which you did explain well, but tell us how he did kind of get connected. The question is, how did he get connected to that? If you could maybe go into a little more detail on exactly why
he was
there.
drafted out of his freshman year at Yale, and he came back to finish college on the GI Bill. And Yale, after the war, of course, was much more diverse. And very politicized and very liberal. It was a very liberal environment. And he joined something called the John Reed Club. The John Reed Club actually had been started at Harvard years before as a campus club. And before that, it had been a club of artists, of course, named after the famous journalist who covered the Russian Revolution. And it was a very innocuous group, was interested in, radical theory. Its main activity was inviting radical speakers to campus. And so this was the late 40s. By the early 50s, that sort of group was on a subversive list. And because he was on a list somewhere, and or somebody had given his name, like here was a radical at Yale, he just ended up being on the House Committee on Un-American Activities list to testify. And what happened then is either you went in and you were very cooperative and you gave them some more names and you said, yeah, I had some radical ideas, but I've reformed, and they were nice to you and let you go home, or you didn't cooperate and they made your life as troublesome as it could possibly be. And so, of course, people ended up on blacklists, on job blacklists, and he was on a news writing blacklist. But life, luckily, didn't care about the blacklist. Henry Luce, despite his own strong anti-communist beliefs and belief in the American century and all that, he just wanted the best talent money could buy. And he had empowered his editors to hire whomever they wanted. So that's how Dad came to work for Life. And once he was associated with Life, the blacklist didn't matter anymore. He was a big wheel. Yeah. He could get good positions at any shoot.
Right. We have another question coming in from our audience, and that is, what did you learn about your father in the course of writing this book? Did you discover something new in the process?
That's an interesting question. I've actually been asked that before. I was lucky in that I knew my father quite well because he had a very strange schedule and he often would be home for long periods. That would mean he wasn't working, but then he'd be gone for long periods. And so, I knew him to be the loving, funny prankster, musical, jazz-loving guy, political. He loved to talk about philosophy and politics. My friends adored him. So I didn't feel that I was lacking in terms of what I knew of him as a human being. I did learn a lot more about World War II, about his family background, about things he went through with my mother, because I interviewed my mother at great length. So I learned things about different aspects of his life as a younger man that I hadn't known through the research I did. Unfortunately, when he started to get sick in the late 90s, I had not interviewed him at length about his life. So for instance, the best little record I have of his World War II experience comes from an interview he did with my older son for a 6th grade school assignment. And then I had to do a lot more research on my own about the places he was, the units he was in. And I also interviewed friends, colleagues. So, pieces of his life that I hadn't known about, I was able to reconstruct.
Right. We have just a few minutes remaining, but I do have another question coming from the audience, and that is, how long did it take you to put this book together? Were there any stories that you wanted to share that there wasn't room for?
Well, there are always some of those, but my father died in early 2001, and basically I took 20 years putting things together, off and on, intermittently, because, I had a full-time job, I had children, I had another life, all sorts of things to do. But then I guess it was about 2018, 19, I finally sat down. I said, I got to write this. And it took me less than a year to actually write the manuscript, but it was 20 years of research, pretty
Right.
much.
I do want to show one last picture. And this is, your dad covered many of the Vietnam War protests, and I think we have a shot from the book of a young John Kerry leading a Vietnam Veterans Against the War protest. That's in 1971. Ted had some early knowledge of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Tell us a little bit about that, and this goes back to his world travels in the 1960s.
Yeah, that was when we were in India pretty early on. He had an assignment for Time Life Books to go to Vietnam and Cambodia. It was a series, like a regional series. It wasn't for news. But while he was in Saigon with a Time writer, um, he was shown around by American advisors and visited a prison camp for young South Vietnamese who were accused of communist affiliations, and began to learn about the presence of advisors in Southeast Asia during the JFK administration. So when we got back home, he and my mom began organizing living room meetings to help people learn about Vietnam, to educate themselves and others. And really were kind of the first wave of the anti-war movement in the Boston area. The picture of John Kerry is a that has a funny story associated with it, because Vietnam Veterans Against the War marched in Paul Revere's ride in reverse from Concord to Boston Common, and they here they are on Lexington Green, and the Lexington Board of Selectmen wouldn't give them permission to camp there overnight. So huge numbers of supporters joined them, and in the middle of the night, hundreds of people were arrested and taken to court, and then kind of slapped on the wrist, fined $5, and allowed to go on to Boston. My father was there till the very last moment, and my father, who was not on assignment, he was photographing this for posterity, sort of went over to the police with a few other people who were still there and said, okay, our turn, arrest us. And the police said, nah, we're done, go home. So my father covered many, many, many demonstrations. He got, hit with billy clubs. His camera equipment was smashed, but he was never arrested.
Oh, wow. Judy, finally, I think we've seen so many of your father's photos, but I think we saved the final photo of your father himself, Ted, and I think he's on the tennis court. Is that correct?
Yeah, my dad tennis was his sport.
Yep.
He played from the time he was a kid, and the first sign of his illness, which was a strange brain disease, was that he couldn't track the tennis ball. So,
yeah, I just wanted folks to see your dad, because we've seen the person behind the camera, so that was in front of the camera, that's the person behind the camera. So, well, Judy, this has been a wonderful conversation. The book is all available, Light, The Life and Legacy of Photographer Ted Polumbaum. It's worth a read, and again, you'll see these photos and many others. And Judy, thank you so much for joining us today on First Five Live.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure and an honor.
And to all our viewers out there, you can send us your thoughts on today's program via social media at the addresses listed below. We'll be posting a recording of this event on our YouTube page, and you can post comments there also. And we hope you'll join us for an episode of First Five Now. That's our next episode on Wednesday, November 10th at 2 p.m., when we'll talk with best-selling author Brad Meltzer, who talks about a recent incident in which one school district banned a list of books, including 2 of his, from its classrooms. We'll hear from the author on what the schools banned and how he and many in the school district spoke, assembled, and petitioned to reverse the ban. I'm John Maynard. Thank you again for joining us for First Five Live.